Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you. Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up. And check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. I'm Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the nonprofit Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius Podcast. In late 2016, I was rear-ended at 65 miles an hour by a truck on the highway, which sent me off-road into a ditch. The impact of the collision gave me a concussion and other injuries. At the hospital, a CT scan showed that I had thyroid nodules, which turned out to be cancer. It was then, when I had a biopsy of my neck, that I realized even if I was a millionaire, I wouldn't want a second or a third biopsy due to the pain and the invasiveness of it. And appointments at that time for thyroid experts were 3 to 6 months out. And I was worried about dying now, even if that was irrational. So because of this, I've decided to raise money to conduct a literature review on steroids, on the causes of anxiety and depression, a condition that affects well over 50 million people in the United States and hundreds of millions worldwide. Our goal is to create a codex, a guide that reveals all possible treatments for anxiety and depression for people that live with the condition, or for loved ones that have it, as my wife and my son do. To find out more about our fundraiser, visit findinggeniusfoundation.org and click on Current Initiatives. And now, to our guest.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius podcast, now part of the Finding Genius Foundation. Today I have Tom Oliver. He's an author. The book is called The Self Delusion, The Surprising Science of Our Connection to Each Other and the Natural World. I'm going to talk about his studies and his works, interactions between land use and climate change and biodiversity. So, Tom, thanks for coming.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me.
If you would, tell me a bit about your background and how you got to this point, and then I want to ask you about your book and what you're working on today.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a professor at the University of Reading, Professor in Applied Ecology. So my background is in environmental science. I've always had an interest in biodiversity from growing up from a young age in Malaysia, and really been able to experience firsthand some of the kind of wonders of ants and strange looking insects over there. So I've always had a passion for protecting nature. But more recently, I've begun to work in areas like systems research, trying to understand, for example, I've had a couple of secondments with government trying to help with environmental policy. And then a part of systems thinking really is about avoiding kind of superficial thinking and, just a techno fix is going to solve everything or an economic solution, and rather thinking about the deeper leverage points. So really about how we think about nature, how people's mindsets really are important for protecting nature. So that's really what's exciting me at the moment.
Well, what do you gather is, I don't know, a common person's perspective on nature? Like, what are some of the major perspectives you've heard?
Well, there's such a diversity, and I think that's one of the important things to recognize. Some major global initiatives to protect nature, so organized by this international committee called the International Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So a bit of a mouthful. It's called IPBES for short. It's essentially a bit like the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change is like for climate. They were convened to really assess the evidence of what's happening to nature globally and provide that evidence towards solutions about what we can do. And actually, they made a bit of a mistake in a way, which they've addressed to their credit, of assuming that everyone kind of has a very similar way of thinking about nature, and we think about it in this very instrumentalist kind of utilitarian way that nature is there providing benefits for humans, even calling them ecosystem services. And we can put a value on that, a monetary value in some cases, and kind of incorporate it into our mainstream economics. And that will essentially solve the problem by getting the prices right. We don't need to change who we are or what we do. We just need to get the prices right. But actually, many people don't think like that. And actually, especially many indigenous cultures, for example, and countries in the global south, have much more of a view of nature, more akin to a kind of an ancestor, that, Mother Nature, and we are part of nature and nature's part of us. And that's a very different understanding, where it actually leads to quite different motivations and behaviors around our actions with regards to the environment.
Well, can you be more specific on that? What do you mean? Like, what?
Yeah,
how would you express, again, a common viewpoint on nature, and then how does it affect that person's behavior, their thoughts about nature, et cetera?
So many countries in the world have actually become a lot more individualistic over recent decades. And that's particularly so for countries like the UK, the US, with a sort of Western culture, as it were, sort of a broad stereotype. And that culture is not just of those countries. It's actually becoming, much more widespread across the planet. And part of, it has strengths, it has weaknesses. But one of the focus of that individualistic mindset is that people tend to see themselves as much more discrete individuals. And we're vying with each other in this kind of competitive marketplace, and we have to build our self-esteem and sell ourselves as a brand. And actually that mindset leads to, if taken too far to the extreme, can lead to mental health problems where, if people feel isolated, they tend to feel lonelier, and loneliness is strongly associated with depression and anxiety. But also it affects how we treat the environment. If we just looking out for ourselves, and at the extreme end of that kind of narcissism is that extreme selfishness. We don't care then for our impacts on other people or on other species. Whenever we buy something, even just a packet of chips or a chocolate bar, the ingredients come from somewhere. And so our purchase has kind of a ripple effect across the whole planet. And it can lead to, if that product has unsustainable palm oil, then it's essentially contributing to the loss of rainforest habitats, replacing them with palm oil plantations. And actually, if we're really individualistic and just looking out for ourselves, that happens a lot. Whereas when people have a sense of identity, which we see other species as part of us, as much more of a kind of kin, we tend to look after them as more of a sense of self-care. We look after the planet just like we look after our family. We don't see it as a kind of transactional relationship. We kind of look after them because they're part of us. They're part of our identity as a sort of family unit. And that sense of kinship can be extended. And actually many indigenous cultures do extend that sense of identity to the whole planet and all the species. And that leads to a greater sense of responsibility about what we buy or how we travel. And actually that can be one of the deep sort of solutions actually to some of these quite severe environmental problems we face.
So what is your perception of nature? How has it changed over the years? And what's your current perception, and how is it informing your research?
So I think I've always had an interest in kind of Eastern philosophy and religion. So many religions like Buddhism and Taoism have quite a clear sense that the self as a discrete unit is an illusion, and that we're actually deeply connected to each other and the natural world. Maybe I wouldn't say those findings have influenced me, but equally I probably found them because that's the kind of feeling I have that seems like a deeper truth to me. What was kind of encouraging is I started my career as a scientist, as a straight ecologist, and studying, for example, interactions between climate and land use and how they affect biodiversity. But actually, as my work has gone on, I realised that often that's just documenting the problems we face in ever more kind of articulate ways, and actually we know species are declining. We know we're in a biodiversity crisis, and the question now is kind of, what do we do about that? So I've kind of moved my research to a much more applied angle. And actually some of the interest that I had when I was younger about my sense of connections to nature has been revealed to me, at least, as kind of a really crucial part of the solution. So just to make it more tangible, to think, I work on butterflies, and there's lots of research exploring how butterflies are declining, and we could extend those type of analyses to other species. So we've done analyses of over 4,500 different species in the UK. So not just butterflies, but beetles, earwigs, birds, plants, and we're capturing those overall trends in biodiversity. We can try and understand what the impacts of climate change are, what land use is doing. But really the solutions don't lie in ecology, they lie in what we're doing to the landscape and the climate. And, so for example, the global food system and our global economy that's driving climate change. So then you think, well, okay, how do we transform the food system? How do we transform our economies? And obviously lots of people have different suggestions for that. One of the kind of ways to transform systems that I feel is neglected, but is starting to become much more recognized, encouragingly, is this deeper mindset change. And actually that's the root of many of our institutions. We talk about the economy or our legal systems, etc., but they're actually just composed of people's worldviews, past and present. And if we want to change those systems, we really need to start changing our mindsets and our worldviews, I believe.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now, back to the show.
Well, so what are some of the admonitions or suggestions in your book? And again, practically, what does that break down to? So changing your mindset, fine, but what can people do to have any impact on the environment?
Yeah, great question. I wrote the book because I wanted to share some of the science of our connection. So it's kind of focused very initially on our bodies and the biology of our bodies, that we're made of 37 or 38 trillion cells, about this human cells, but we've got the same number of bacterial cells in our body. And, our bodies are continually rebuilding themselves. So each cell is with us just a few weeks for our skin cells and our gut cells, for example. And so there's this kind of turnover of material, and there's nothing there that's permanent or discrete about us. We're kind of a flux of energy and matter. Obviously, our DNA is the instructions that builds that body, but that DNA is borrowed from our ancestors, and we pass it on to ancestors to come. So the physical sense of our bodies is, we are deeply connected to the natural world. And our minds, actually, we think of, okay, that's me in my head, but actually, every word that we hear, even pheromones, smells below the conscious radar, influencing our moods and our behaviors. So our minds are porous, and we're kind of connected to each other. So that was the book in a nutshell, is presenting that kind of information. And then the latter half of the book is saying, well, why does that matter? And as I sort of started to suggest, it's important how we see ourselves, because that's the root cause of many of our behaviors in the world. So the book, I wanted to present this evidence, and it's a kind of evidence-based spirituality, if you were, because it's taking some of the messages of those philosophies and religions which say the self is an illusion. But rather than just saying that and kind of expecting people to believe it, this is trying to sort of show some of the evidence and people can decide for themselves. So as a scientist, I wanted to say, well, does it work? If you present people with this evidence, can you start to change mindsets and change behaviors? So I did a survey before. There's a survey available as a QR code before people read the book, ideally, and afterwards. And so I could analyze whether it was effective in changing mindsets. And it just showed that there's a significant increase in people's sense of connectedness to nature when, engaging with the ideas in the book. Now, that's absolutely not to say that it's just about, get some knowledge and it will change our identities. What I think is more happening is that when we exposed to some of those kind of what I feel are quite awesome, facts, and they're not all things I've discovered, but I've kind of, harvested them from across a broad range of sciences, from, philosophy, from neuroscience and psychology to biology and sustainability. But those facts, I think, motivate people to then pursue practices which can be really important in changing mindsets. So this is a long way of coming around to your question, because I think it's a really important point to say it's not just about information. And, I could look at an Olympic archer and you could tell me in the theory of how she's, pulling back her bow to fire the arrow into the target 100 meters away. And I could understand the nuance, all the kind of muscle changes and the exact movements, but I wouldn't be able to do that. I need to practice it. I need to kind of actually change the neural connections in my body. And similar for our brains, the way we think. To change the way we think requires kind of exercise and practice and thinking in a different way. So I think, some of those facts give a motivation to pursue practices. And those practices might be things like engaging, mindfulness practices outside. So we're kind of meditating with nature. It might be, for some people, they might prefer just working with other people in a community organization outside. For others, it might be bird watching or sketching nature. Even some approaches like, computer games, we might think that's something that, we're locked away in our rooms playing them on our own. And it's a very kind of isolated activity. But certain games can be designed to increase our kind of sense of empathy and compassion. So there's some nice studies showing kind of promising avenues in that direction as well. So I think, to answer the question, there's a whole range of different practices, and it's going to be different, what's best for everyone. But I think what science lends is we can start to take a kind of more evidence-based approach as to what really works, what kind of intervention works, and we can measure people's attitudes before and after, and we can start to develop this science of how we, develop a kind of inner change. In our societies, we focused a lot in the last 100 years or so on kind of outer change and technology, but actually the kind of inner development, I think, has stalled perhaps quite a lot.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
Well, I'm not sure I'm understanding what facts are you talking about. What do you mean? What are some of the facts, and how does it change people's mindset?
When the sense of ourselves as being isolated, kind of feels intuitive, and there's an explanation behind that, because when we have a sense of self, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't have a sense of self, because if we didn't have one, we'd be kind of bumbling around, and we wouldn't be able to collate our memories, we wouldn't be able to find food. So a sense of self evolved because it's valuable for our survival, and but actually our cultures influence that sense of self, and our education systems, maybe encouraging us too much to kind of build self-esteem and sell ourselves as a brand, or our governments, telling us, for example, Margaret Thatcher in the UK famously said, "There's no such thing as society, only individuals and their families." And Boris Johnson, our current Prime Minister, saying, greed is good. With regards to, our solutions to the pandemic, suggesting that capitalism was the kind of solution to the pandemic, forgetting the kind of important elements of collective, solutions like mask wearing and self-isolation, etc. So our cultures can really influence those mindsets. Our education system is another one, and they can really push that sense of self, push the pendulum too far, and it becomes maladaptive in that context. So an analogy, for example, might be our evolved tendency to seek out sugary or fatty foods. That's something that's useful when we evolved in prehistoric times, because those were scarce food sources. But actually in modern cultures where we have hyper abundance of those food sources and advertising kind of pushing us towards them, that leads to this crisis where we have, a quarter of the world's population overweight or obese, and yet there's a quarter of the world's population still malnourished. And so that obesity crisis is partly driven by that maladaptive nature of that evolved trait that's become maladaptive, or detrimental is another word, in the modern world with our cultures. So bringing that back to the sense of self, that sense of self is become maladaptive in the modern world where we push it too far. And so that's, I believe, the way that our education systems are kind of raising us now, with this very isolated sense of identity. And actually people also are less able to experience nature. So because they don't have it on their doorstep, we live often in urban areas, declines in nature and biodiversity within those areas. Sometimes parks are very far away, green spaces.
Well, how about locking people down and them experiencing nature? The pandemic response and all that didn't seem to foster anyone's connection to anything, it seems.
Actually, I think that there's some evidence that many people, I don't know, in the UK at least, and some countries in Europe, found nature a bit more during the lockdown, because they couldn't travel to their nearest mall, or, they actually ended up exploring their local areas a bit more and taking time to be outside a bit more, because we can't be in shops and cafes. And actually, I think sense of nature connection may have increased in some cases. I mean, equally, that's balanced with mental health impacts of the lockdown as well. So it's a kind of complex pattern. Just to kind of come around to that point. So in the modern world, our sense of self is become maladaptive. And so it's an evolved trait that it's been taken too far. And I think it's important to kind of address that balance. And one of the ways to do that is to see that this sense of self is an evolved trait. And just like, our tendency to seek out fatty foods, we may feel like we have the urge to do that, especially if there's culture kind of advertising pushing us towards it. But when we start to realize, I'm kind of programmed this way, and these advertisements are pushing my buttons, we can start to get a wiser outlook and start to step back. And I think the same is for our sense of self. Cultures may encourage us to be hyper competitive and to the degree of selfishness, but actually we can take a step back and say, well, actually that's just an illusion, this sense of discrete identity. And there's also a logic that when we see that connectedness, we actually act, as I mentioned, in a much more sustainable way, looking after each other, looking after the natural world. So as opposed to the kind of approach where we view nature as an asset, as a resource, we instead see it as part of us. And that changes quite deeply the way we relate and the way we behave towards nature.
That makes sense. So are there suggestions in the book for people not only to reconnect with nature, but to help sustain it? Or what are some of the suggestions in the book?
Yeah, I didn't want to be prescriptive in about what people do. This was very much a sort of first attempt at harnessing some of the evidence and really about the illusory nature of our sense of self. And actually that I really wanted to bring readers a kind of sense of awe and wonder when we kind of hear about the science that is spread across so many disparate fields. And I think that's one of the issues, that we have a very intelligent society in terms of, the level of our scientific knowledge now is huge. We have huge journal issues devoted to very niche topics, but that kind of bridging between disciplines and the synthesis is often less done than it should be, perhaps. And so actually bringing together some of these insights from, neuroscience and psychology and cell biology around our sense of identity, to me, that kind of gave a sense of wonder. So that was really my aim, was to sort of show people some of this evidence in an engaging way, and not necessarily say, and this means you should do this. But actually, I think the deeper question is about who we are, and do we have a view of ourselves and our relationship with nature and the rest of the world, which is based on sort of fact, or is it something that is based on a fiction that's kind of allowed to have propagated? So that was really my motivation, rather than saying, okay, here's what you can do. I mean, to come back to your question as an ecologist, so what can people do? I mean, there's lots we can do, in terms of how we buy, how we travel and what we buy are kind of key factors, because biodiversity is being lost at kind of a million cuts. Each small action kind of accumulates and causes this vast tidal wave of impacts. So, every moment we're making decisions, and just being a bit more mindful about the impacts of those decisions is actually a kind of crucial factor. That's not to say that, regulation or policy is not important, that kind of top-down approach. But actually, as I mentioned at the start, a lot of those policies get driven because policymakers get pushed in a certain direction because of public, popular opinion. So I think changing mindsets is to me one of the sort of deeper leverage points about how we kind of change the rules of the game and protect the natural world.
So what, I don't know, how is the sense of self important in relating to nature? What do you mean the illusion of self?
Of self is that we have a tendency to see ourselves as a kind of isolated entity, like an ego, me as separate from other things out there. And actually that identity is also the kind of root cause of how we see things in the world as objects. But there was a physicist, David Bohm, who made the point that actually when he studied, the nature of these things in terms of their physics deeply, there's no such thing as an object in the sense that it's unchanging and it's fixed. Everything is in a state of flux. Everything is kind of interacting with other atoms. And, even a bit of paper is kind of losing molecules all the time and is in the state of decomposition, even if it's, albeit very slow to our kind of scale of perception. So Bohm was suggesting, we shouldn't even have nouns. He was saying everything should be a verb. Everything should be in an action. Obviously, it's hard to organize a society where we can't use objects. So, we can't use nouns. They're a shorthand, and they're a useful shorthand. But sometimes we forget they're a shorthand. And so, just to give an example, we call someone a criminal and we say, well, that defines them. And actually, research shows from a kind of Western perspective, that's very much how we see people. We give them labels and we say, well, that person is a criminal, is bad, is evil. But actually, alternative cultures, traditional cultures from a more Eastern perspective tend to see the context. So they say, well, that person was acting bad because they didn't have their lunch, or because they were mistreated as a child, or because the situation was such that it led them to behave that way. So they're seeing that much more contextual relationship. There are other really nice, interesting studies that show, for example, when you can put a fish tank and put some Western people with very Western mindsets in front of it, and they'll notice the objects in the foreground. And people from a more Eastern cultural perspective will tend to see the background more and the relationships between the objects more. So there's very different ways of viewing the world. And our reductionist kind of object-orientated way is important for science. And there's no doubt that it's led to huge scientific advances. But now we're in the era of these kind of what people call wicked problems. So climate change, obesity, mental health crises. And it's really about understanding systemic relationships. So how all these different objects in the world are kind of connected and how they interact with each other. And that it requires a quite different type of understanding. So kind of systems sciences and actually more kind of wisdom-based approaches to understanding how these social and ecological systems work is kind of, for me, I see as the next kind of level of our understanding. And to bring this back to the self, which you asked about, the sense of self. So research shows that people have an ego, that's fine. They can also have a kind of meta-personal identity. So meta being a sort of higher level. So they can have an identity where they see themselves linked to other people and linked to the natural world. And when they have that sense of identity, it doesn't mean they lose the ego perspective. They can still go back to it. They can kind of flip back and forth. So they can say, I see, here's me in my head and treating it as if I'm an I and I'm a separate object and the world's out there. Or we can flip it and see ourselves as much more connected. But if you only have the ego level, you can't flip up to the metapersonal level. So I think there is an evolution in terms of our kind of sense of consciousness. And it's important that we make that step, because otherwise we're kind of stuck on those lower levels. And we know that highly individualistic, selfish behavior leads to, the tragedy of the commons and the loss of biodiversity, pollution of the air, pollution of the climate, pollution of the oceans, which is everything that we're seeing. So it's really important that we start to kind of make that next step in terms of our understanding. The poet T.S. Eliot made a nice quote in the 1930s, actually. Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? And for me, that kind of really sums it up in terms of, not saying we don't want information, but we need to kind of synthesize it into knowledge, and we need to harness that knowledge to kind of bring wisdom in our approach to the world.
Well, very good. Tom, what's the best way for people to, start on this journey and find out more about your work? Where can they get the book? And can you restate the title? And then, where can they contact you?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really open for people, getting in touch with ideas and reading recommendations, because I think that's one of the nicest things when people say, I've heard your ideas and I like them, but have you read so-and-so? So please do get in touch. The book, my book is called The Self Delusion, The Surprising Science of How We Are Connected to Each Other and the Natural World. And I think, you can get it on Amazon, or you can get it on from your local bookseller, who might be more likely to pay tax. You can get it, various places like that. And I'm at University of Reading. So if you search Tom Oliver, University of Reading, you'll be able to find my email address. And then, if there are ideas or questions or anything, people can get in touch. Always happy to engage.
Well, very good. Tom, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
No, thanks. Thanks for inviting me, Richard. Cheers.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.